How's everyone doing? Today we're ranking the 16 personality types by how angry they are. So let's get into it. So last time people rightfully pointed out I didn't quite define what it meant to be emotional, and today I'm going to try and define what it means to be angry. I'm going to use hot-tempered as kind of a descriptor. Somebody who can get angry very quickly, might lose their patience, might feel a lot of physical rage. It is a hard thing to describe very accurately, and it might not be perfect, but just stick with me as we go through the types. I'll try and be as nuanced as possible. So first, we have ESTPs. So ESTPs, they have extroverted sensing hero. And so what this means is that they can definitely feel a lot of rage when it comes to how they translate their emotions into the physical world. So that means they may not always internalize their rage with like an introverted sensing perspective, where they can kind of be patient and endure. They can sometimes explode outwardly. So there can definitely be an anger to this. It can often result in kind of a physical outlashing. So for ESTPs, I would definitely say A tier for when it comes to their anger. They have pretty low introverted feeling, which means they can shove down their own feelings, which helps them from getting too angry, as they can sometimes, ignore their own negative emotion. But they can still feel a lot of that kind of quote unquote rage with their extroverted sensing, which means they can definitely translate how they're feeling, what they're thinking outwardly into the world very directly, instead of necessarily internalizing it and kind of calming down. So I would say A tier is good for ESTPs. For ISTPs, a little bit more of that introverted energy. They do have extroverted sensing, but that extroverted sensing is in their first function. It's their second function. They can definitely feel a lot of anger and rage internally. I would say ISTPs, a very similar tier to ESTPs. ISTPs have more internalized anger though, because they do have introverted feeling demon and introverted sensing critic. So they can feel a lot of anger internally towards themselves, a lot of internal bitterness and rage and negative emotion, and that can sometimes come outward. But I would say a little bit less angry than that S tier of absolute anger, which we'll get into. But, I think B or A tier is okay for ISTPs. ISTPs can be kind of a stoic, calm presence. And so if you're going to compare it directly to ESTPs, you could argue there's a little bit more of a balance, but there's also some of that, internal rage that can come from having very high SE and having that very negative introverted feeling, introverted sensing loops. So I would say A to B tier is probably a fair way to assess ISTPs, although I think it matters, their development matters as well and what they're focused on. I might move that one a little bit later, we'll see. For ESFPs, so same thing as, these other types here. Definitely, this is a good one. So ESFPs have introverted feeling parent, which means they do have a lot of emotions. The second function is really pessimistic as well. So they do have a lot of negative emotions going along with that just general emotional state. And they do have that extroverted sensing hero as well. So they can definitely experience a lot of rage. They do have introverted sensing nemesis, which means they can have a little bit more patience than some other types, but also can lose their patience as well. Ooh, this is an interesting one. I'm going to say they definitely have that S tier potential for having those, bouts of anger and, losing that temper, because they do have that high introverted feeling in a pessimistic slot. They do have high extroverted sensing. It can definitely explode outward. Their emotions can explode outward, and they can definitely feel kind of those bouts of anger. So I'm going to say S tier for ESFPs. And then we have ISFPs, so a little bit more calm temper. They have introverted feeling hero. So while they do have a lot of feelings, they're a little bit more optimistic feelings. And they have a little bit lower extroverted sensing. So I'm going to say that helps them out a little bit. I'm going to say B tier, because ISFPs, they have that stereotype, of course, of kind of the chill stoner person, somebody who's able to kind of feel positive emotions and go with the flow and just like live in the moment. And they have that ability to be calm when they're in that kind of environment. But ISFPs can be more angry maybe than people think. They still have that super high extroverted sensing, which can cause them to kind of externalize their emotions. They still have a lot of emotions, so they can get really emotional as well. And ISFPs, they just have that potential as well, but not as much as maybe the other types that I've talked about so far. So while they can be calm, sometimes they can definitely explode, having that SE-FI combo, which can be very angry. Then we have ESTJs. ESTJs are an interesting one. ESTJs, I'm thinking maybe A tier, because ESTJs, they have that super low extroverted feeling, so that disregard for other people's feelings. They can definitely, internalize their emotions and explode them outwardly with introverted feeling in that fourth slot, which is kind of that anxiety slot. It's kind of that anxious attachment slot, and they can definitely feel no emotion, but then over explode with their emotions when they face them. And that super low FE can make them pretty angry towards other people. They do have introverted sensing higher, which means their anger can often kind of come out as like an internal bitterness. They can just kind of feel resentment and bitterness and negativity towards themselves and others, and it can be a really bitter anger. If they're like a boss or a higher up position, they can definitely seem very impatient and kind of angry all the time. They may not have the outward explosions with lower extroverted sensing quite as much as some people with extroverted sensing, but they can definitely be angry people if they don't kind of process their internal emotions as well. So I would say A tier. And then we have ISTJ. ISTJs can definitely feel a lot of that internal anger and bitterness that I talked about with ESTJs, but a little bit more calm. They have that introverted sensing hero, which is a bit more patient, a little bit more optimistic. They can endure things, they can internalize things, and they can kind of, experience things without necessarily having it go outwardly into the extroverted world. And so I think ISTJs a little bit more balanced. They can have, bits of impatience and rage, and they do have introverted feeling in the top slots, which means they can definitely have a lot of emotional reactions to things, but they're a little bit more balanced, a little bit more, able to experience things with high introverted sensing and not necessarily have as negative of an experience as some other types. And then we have ESFJs. ESFJs, high FE, definitely conflict avoidant, wanting to generally be calm. I would say C tier. ESFJs pretty good at being patient for the most part, pretty good at, being able to endure negative experiences and be able to solve problems and be able to manage crises. So yeah, ESFJs, I would say they can definitely have, of course, moments of rage, as everybody can, and they have SE critic and they have FI nemesis, and they have that, negative emotional state sometimes. But generally, ESFJs looking to kind of, not necessarily overreact, not necessarily let their emotions take hold. They're going to be aware of other people's feelings. They're going to be aware of that. They're going to be able to endure things and try and stay as calm as possible. So I think in general, they can be pretty calm. And I would say the same for ISFJs. I would say they're generally pretty calm. I don't even know if I'll put anyone in D tier. I don't know. It's hard to say D tier for anybody because everybody gets angry. We'll see if I even think anyone's D tier, but maybe not, which maybe means I should move some around. I'm trying to think between ESFJ and ISFJ who gets angrier more, and it might just look a little different. ESFJs out in the external world, they can get insecure about their intelligence and can lash out. ISFJs able to really internalize and endure things and stay pretty calm, but they do have that SC nemesis, that ESFP shadow that can come out, and as we talked about before, that a lot of anger potential there. So I think you could argue potentially putting ESFJs lower, but I'm going to put them in C tier for now. Calm. D tier, dead inside, might not even apply. So then we have ENTPs. ENTPs, this is kind of an interesting one. ENTPs often seen as like a debater, somebody who's able to antagonize people, cause a lot of problems, but they also have FE in that third slot. They generally don't want to make people feel bad, and they're willing to say the truth if they have to, and they, want to say the truth and be honest, but that's not necessarily anger. In terms of emotional outbursts, they have really low introverted feeling. They have introverted sensing in the ego, which means they can kind of endure and try and stay calm in situations, but at the same time, they still have that ability to be kind of angry when they get, pissed off, which everybody can. But I'm going to say generally balanced for ENTP. I think that they can kind of have those two sides of them. They have the INTJ shadow, which can get more angry, and then they have the ISFJ subconscious, which can be more calm and enduring. So it really depends on their state of mind. But in general, ENTPs can stay pretty balanced, not be too, emotional and ragey, but sometimes if their experience is affected, they can get pretty annoyed. Then we have INTPs. I would say generally INTPs, while they can feel a lot of internal rage, internal anger. Oh, not sure if that came up for everyone else. Getting notifications, aren't I? Okay. So INTPs, while they can internalize a lot of anger and resentment and negative emotions because they have that super pessimistic introverted feeling, which means they can feel really bad about themselves, and that can definitely cause anger. I would say generally a little bit less in terms of external rage and anger outbursts. They're going to internalize and endure things and stuff them down deep, and they're going to kind of ignore their feelings and stuff those feelings down, and they're just going to try and get by. Of course, when pushed, they can definitely become very angry and have an outburst like everyone can, but generally more on the calm side of the 16 personality types, not letting their emotions take a hold of them too much, not always going to necessarily speak up and be domineering and yell at people and have those outbursts. They're going to try generally to keep that inside, but when it does come out, it can obviously come out as well in a very big way. And then we have ENTJs. ENTJs have both introverted feeling and extroverted sensing, which we talked about being very susceptible to rage. They have the low introverted sensing, low patience with people, FE demon, low patience with people even more. And that, extroverted sensing in that third slot, being very optimistic, definitely externalizing their emotions outwardly, and having those negative feeling slots can definitely make them angry and have a difficult time, managing anger and managing those feelings. So I would say in general, ENTJs can definitely deal with, anger issues and having that explosive personality, having that emotional personality, which they don't always like, and they don't always want to feel those emotions. And that can kind of be stuffed down, but it can also come out very strongly. And ENTJs just in general can be very explosive. So I'm going to say S tier for ENTJs. And then we have INTJs. INTJs, very similar. I'm wondering A or S tier, because INTJs do have that SE-FI combo as well, where they have those emotions, and when those emotions are hurt, they really externalize and explode outwardly with that FI-SE combo, that low SI patience, that low FE ability to kind of put other people's feelings above yours. That's really what can cause a lot of these kind of anger explosions, although, there's different ways to define anger, of course, but when it comes to general rage and anger and explosive personality, I would say INTJs definitely go into S or A tier. So it's kind of between those two. INTJs, while they can't be very, very explosive if challenged, they can also sometimes just be introverts. If something's coming up, they might just internalize it. They might be angry about it. They might go away. They might go into private. I'm going to say definitely can be very angry, but they sometimes have that time where they're not going to necessarily externalize it as much. And that's kind of subjective, whether it's just internal anger or external anger. I think it is hard to define these terms, of course. But INTJs, they do have that ability to have that optimistic FI. They can feel good about themselves. They can sometimes just go out, do their own thing, be alone, and that can help them from being the absolute S tier of anger and necessarily always, exploding. But when it comes to their personal relationships, their introverted moments, one-on-one relationships, that's where the anger can really come out. Whereas those extroverted situations, a little bit less. So it depends how you define that anger, if it's more internal situations or extroverted situations. So yeah, depends how you define that. And then we have ENFPs. ENFPs, generally not necessarily the most angry people, but I would say still B tier, because they do have that FI-SI in the pessimistic combo. So they do feel a lot of negative emotions, and they do feel, a negative experience sometimes. And that bitterness and that resentment and those negative feelings can definitely add up, and they can feel very angry sometimes. And so for ENFPs, sometimes they're very calm and easygoing and kind of loving. And then sometimes ENFPs can be in a really dark space as well. So I would say B tier is fair, because sometimes they can have those external explosions of emotion and rage if their feelings are challenged, if they're challenged as being weak or, being disrespected by other people. I think ENFPs can have a difficult time with that. So I would say B tier between the two, probably. INFPs, a little bit more on the calmer side. It's hard to say D tier for anyone, which is probably my fault in the way I've ranked this. D tier is difficult because obviously everybody has a lot of capacity for anger, because it's a way of us to defend our egos, a way for us to defend ourselves, defend others, and it's important, right? And there's different types of anger. There's obviously anger towards others for just reasons and for selfish reasons. So it's difficult to say anyone's D tier, although D tier in the ranking list should still count as some people, and maybe I'll loop back right at the end and see if I can distribute it a little bit better. But INFPs generally not the most outwardly ragey. They do have a lot of emotions, of course, and they can feel a lot of internal bitterness and depression and negative things. But INFPs generally aren't going to externalize those things. They still have that FE nemesis, conflict avoidance. They still have very low SC, so they're not going to explode and be super loud and in your face angry all the time. I think that INFPs generally are going to keep that inside and try not to let that out too much. And then we have ENFJs. So ENFJs, I would say B tier. I think it's good to have that distribution. I think ENFJs can definitely have that ability with that ESTJ superego to be super cutting and cruel with their words and with the truth as kind of a defense mechanism, because they're always trying to help people. They're trying to put other people first. And when those people aren't appreciative, when they're not grateful, when they're not getting anything from those people in the relationship, they can definitely cut them down and try and kind of equalize things, because they feel like they've been lifting them up and boosting them up and helping them all the time. And then they have that other side, that more cutting edge, to come out. And the ENFJs do have extroverted sensing in an optimistic slot, which means that externalization of rage in the moment, in that immediate impact loudly, is something that they have that capacity to do more than some of the other types, which are a bit more soft-spoken. And so I think ENFJs can definitely have that anger come out, but at the same time, they're not necessarily going to be raging out at everyone all the time, like some types have more of a difficulty with. And so I think for that reason, ENFJs a little bit lower on the tier list. And then we have INFJs. I think INFJs, same kind of deal. I think it's difficult to kind of rank that, just like with all of them. But INFJs, they do have that really low FI, so they can often shove down their emotions, and they do have that high FE, so they can be conflict avoidant. They're not always going to rage out and be super emotional in someone's face. And so I think that in general, INFJs, they do try and stay calm, but they do have that ability to be very cutting and defend themselves and have that, rage come out. They have SC aspirational, so they can definitely bring that out and be in the moment and use that SCTI. Be super honest, be super cutting, be super, straight to the point in the moment, and have those big reactions. So INFJs, they might seem kind of soft and emotional, but they can actually really come out at the same time. So I would say that, I think it's fair to kind of put them in that B tier balance between somebody who can have that anger. They have that SI demon bitterness, which means they can feel very angry towards themselves, and FI, very angry towards themselves as well. Low self-esteem, very self-angry, if that's a word. But they can also have that kind of externalize if they feel like they've been betrayed or if they feel vengeance. So INFJs can definitely be kind of balanced between the two. It's difficult to say any of these types, aren't angry or don't have that capacity to be angry. If I were gonna, try and, change the distribution, I would say maybe we could put, SFJs a little bit lower, and try and distribute it differently. But I think that in general, it's a difficult one to make, because I think that all of the personality types, are angry about different things. And I think as we go through the list here, ESFPs, very explosive externally and very, negative with their emotions. Same with ENTJs, and that can create a very loud, angry, rage-inducing experience where they can definitely have that overtake them and have that anger issue. ESTPs and ISTPs, high SE and negative emotions internally, so that can cause a lot of problems as well. They can be really hard on themselves and really hard internally, and sometimes that can explode outward with that SE. ESTJs, if they have that combo of negative affect, negative SI, negative FI, feeling bad about themselves, being uncomfortable with their experience, and that super low FE means they can sometimes externalize that as well without caring how it affects other people. INTJs have that ESFP subconscious. They have that ability to, internalize their emotions, stay introverted, do their own thing. But then when it comes out very strongly. And in their kind of more introverted relationships one-on-one, that can come out a lot more. And then ISFPs, ISTJs, ENTPs, ENFPs, ENFJs, INFJs, as we talked about throughout the video, have a more moderate experience where they can sometimes have reasons to be more emotional, reasons to kind of blow up, but generally a little bit more on the calm side and trying to stay in that balance zone. And then we have INTPs, INFPs, background types, like to do their own thing. They have optimistic SI, which means they can be very patient and enduring, but they can also have polarizing experiences. INTPs, super low FI demon. So yeah, INTPs can be very bitter over time when they're internalizing their negative emotions, but INFPs can become bitter over time too when they're feeling like they're, deserve something better, and they can be very negative towards the world with FE nemesis, so there can be anger that kind of festers there. SFJs, while generally the least angry of the type, they do shove down their feelings, and they shove down that kind of physical extroverted reaction with low SE, and they try in general to endure things and keep things to themselves and avoid conflict and do that all the time. But they can still come out very angry when challenged, and they can use that TI to be very cutting and honest and logical and very analytical. And so that by no means that they're necessarily soft. It just means they try not to let their emotions take over and explode outwardly, but they do have that potential. So I think that it's difficult to kind of rank those too low, but it's also difficult to rank them too high as well. So let me know in the comments down below if you agree with this tier list. Let me know what you would change and why, and let me know what type you are in the comments down below as well. Please like and subscribe as it helps the channel, and click the bell to get those notifications. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.